So as Gary said, my name's Alicia Evangelidis. I'm the director of the Rule of Law Index at the World Justice Project, and I'm here with my colleague Lauren Kitts, who's our director of engagement. So we are very happy to be here today at the World Justice Project. For those of you who may not be familiar, our mission is to advance the rule of law around the world. We primarily do this through data production and stakeholder engagement. And we're here today to talk a little bit about our work measuring adherence to the rule of law globally, and in the U.S. in particular. Our flagship research product is the Rule of Law Index. So we'll start with an intro to our work, and we'll present some of our global index findings. Then we will turn to some U.S.-specific findings. I think that'll probably be the most interesting to all of you. And we'll talk a little bit about a new U.S. subnational initiative that we are launching. We're in the very, very early stages of planning this initiative, and we would really love to get your all's feedback on it, given that you are on the front lines of protecting the rule of law and judicial independence in the U.S. So we would love your feedback on that. So with that, I will get started. Let's see if I can do both of these things at once.
I can be your assistant.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, so a little bit about the WJP and the Rule of Law Index. So the World Justice Project is an interdisciplinary and independent and multidisciplinary, I just switched the words, organization that started in 2009. We started as an initiative of the American Bar Association. There we go. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C., and as I said, our mission is to create knowledge, build awareness, and stimulate action to advance the rule of law worldwide. Okay. Oh.
Wow.
That's crazy. I don't know what happened there. Huh. Okay. Well, oops. Let's see if it, okay.
Well, you've got some abstract art.
It does not like this graphic. Yes. So sorry. You have to guess what the rest of the words are. So the Rule of Law Index is kind of as it sounds. It is a tool that we use to measure rule of law adherence in different countries around the world. It measures the experiences and perceptions of the rule of law, and currently we cover 143 countries and jurisdictions, including the U.S. The index contains over 550 perception and experience-based questions, so all of those questions make up one index score. This is a report that we release annually. The current edition of the index from 2025 contains responses from over 215,000 households and over 4,100 expert questionnaires, again, from all these 143 countries around the world. And again, for our most recent index, which was 2025, the period of data collection was February through June of 2025. We are currently collecting data for our 2026 index, which will come out a little bit later this year, usually in the fall. Okay, thank you. All right, it likes this slide. That's good. So just a couple of thoughts about who uses our index. So generally, users of our index fall into 4 different categories. We have governments and bilateral aid agencies. So some examples, we have some nice flags up there. Governments of India, Kazakhstan, Kosovo, Mexico, Philippines, Thailand, US, Uzbekistan, all use our data to help track their progress on different reform initiatives that they're implementing. Multilateral organizations are also big users of our data. We work a lot with the European Union, the OECD, International Monetary Foundation, Open Government Partnership, World Bank, the UN. Our data is also really helpful for civil society in the media, at least we hope it is. But still, civil society tends to use it for kind of advocacy purposes to highlight, different issues that are particularly prevalent or particularly important in a country at the moment. And the media can use our data to kind of give context on the rule of law situation in a country, just to, again, give context kind of to a story, set the scene about what the rule of law situation is. And then businesses also use our data, which that is a little surprising to some people. But a number of businesses will use our data to help them with make investment decisions. So businesses and rating agencies, I should say, to help them make investment decisions if they're going to maybe expand into a new country, they want to open a new office there, or they're looking to maybe loan money to a new country or a new government, they might want to use our data to see how does the rule of law actually work in the country? Is there a lot of corruption? Are contracts adhered to? Things like that. So yeah, just a little bit about the uses of our data. It's pretty widespread. I'm sure there are other uses, but these are kind of the four major categories.
Doing so many things, different hands with different screens. Okay. So before we get a little bit more into what the data says and how we collect it, we wanted to take a minute to talk about why we measure the rule of law. And I think, for those of us who were at the plenary discussion yesterday, we talked a lot about the value of the law and some of the intrinsic value that it provides. And I think as court professionals, we don't have to sell that to you. But there are some material benefits to rule of law that we think are great supporters for the rule of law as a concept for why we collect this data, and could also potentially be useful for you in your work, and especially in court communications. And all of these slides I'm going to show you are available on our website. So what we've done with our data is correlate it with some other indices that measure other things, mostly related to quality of life. So this is our data on rule of law performance in different countries compared to GDP per capita. So you'll see that there's a correlation along the scatter plot. So what we see in our data is that where rule of law is stronger, so is the economy. And then this graph shows rule of law performance in countries compared to the Global Peace Index. So this is demonstrating this. You can see, again, there's a correlation. Rule of law is stronger in countries that enjoy greater peace. And this compares the rule of law index with life expectancy. So as you can see, the longer countries where people live longer are also countries where the rule of law tends to be stronger. And then finally, this is average years of education per person compared to our index scores. So you can see, again, there's a correlation. So and as I said, this is available on our website. And so we use this data to make the case for why rule of law is important, not just as a foundation of free societies and that delivers certainty and fairness, but it actually delivers material benefits in people's everyday lives.
All right, now I'm regretting the decision to switch off a little bit between our presentation because we keep having to stop and start with the mic, but all good. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the definition of the rule of law that we use for our index and the methodology that we use to actually produce and collect and produce our data and scores. So next slide. Oh, sorry, that's me. Okay, so our index is based on 4 universal principles. So we define the rule of law as a durable system of laws, institutions, norms, and community commitment that delivers these 4 universal principles: accountability, just law, open government, and accessible and impartial justice. So this borrows heavily from a lot of theoretical work on the rule of law, but these principles are also present in many legal traditions of today and of the past. So we decided to build on that with our definition. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. And this definition is really grounded in the idea that the law imposes limits on exercise of power by the government and private interests. Political power has to be exercised in accordance with the law. It can't go on unchecked. It cannot be exercised in a manner that's arbitrary or in self-interest. And then disputes between private individuals or private individuals and the government also have to be adjudicated in an independent manner. So that's another kind of foundational principle of our definition of the rule of law. Here is our conceptual framework. So from these 4 principles, we developed 8 different factors and 44 sub-factors to make up our conceptual framework for rule of law and for our index scores. I won't go into each of them and read them all. I know the text is a little bit small, but this is all available on our website too and in the app. But as you can see, each factor draws on numerous sub-factors. These are of course, very complicated topics and very detailed topics. So we had to break it down into different component parts. But as an example, factor one is constraints on government powers, in other words, checks and balances. And you can see that we have broken that down into 6 component parts. So constraints on government powers includes constraints by the legislature, the judiciary, independent auditing and review. We also have kind of civil society or non-governmental checks on power. We look at whether or not government officials are sanctioned for misconduct, and then the transition of power being subject to the law. So those are the component parts that we break that down to. And there actually are a lot of other component parts, but we won't go into all of those today. But happy to answer any questions on that. Just a note that our framework does technically, or our conceptual framework does technically recognize the importance of informal justice systems in countries where formal legal systems are weak or remote or perceived as ineffective. Unfortunately, we decided that we were not able to include this in our aggregate scores because there were a lot of challenges with cross-country assessments. Some countries use informal legal systems a lot, some countries don't, and we weren't able to kind of compare apples to apples when we were looking at how these work in different countries. So conceptually, we recognize it, but we don't actually produce scores on traditional or informal justice systems, at least at the moment. Okay, so our measurement, interesting that this image worked and the other one didn't. So in terms of our measurement approach, what we do is we mainly collect surveys. We produce 2 sources of output-oriented primary data. It's mainly based or comprised of experience and perception-based questions. So we have 2 different types of surveys that we administer. We have a general population poll. We also call it our GPP. It's a probability sample. Historically, 1,000 respondents are surveyed per country. Sometimes it's smaller in countries that are a little bit smaller. Some of our Caribbean island countries have slightly smaller respondent pools. But yes, we have that general population poll. And then we also have our qualified respondents questionnaires, or our QRQ. These are completed by in-country experts in civil and commercial law, criminal and constitutional law, labor law, and public health. So these experts can be lawyers, other legal practitioners, academics, public health practitioners, and the like. So those are primary 2 sources of data, and we, again, administer all these surveys ourselves. Or with the general population poll, we contract a local polling company to do the work, but we work with them closely. So this is all primary data that we're collecting for the index. We do supplement the index scores with a little bit of data from third-party sources. About like 5 to 8% of our index scores comes from third-party sources that would be not really possible to collect through survey data. Okay, so I'm going to start and go into our global findings before we go into some of the U.S. findings, just to kind of set the stage for you all. So this is a heat map of the status of the rule of law in all of the countries that we cover. The scale is not working either. So sorry about that. But the green colors, or like the darker green colors, indicate stronger rule of law. The more red colors or kind of orange colors indicate weaker rule of law. So you can kind of see that most of the countries we cover fall somewhere in the middle. Some countries are a little stronger. Some countries are a little bit weaker. But this just shows the status of the rule of law in each country as of 2025. Our top performers for this year and for a number of years now have been mostly Scandinavian countries: Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. We also have New Zealand in the top 5. And then our bottom 5 performers this year are Nicaragua, Haiti, Cambodia, Afghanistan, and Venezuela. In terms of movement, that is sometimes a little bit more interesting to look at how different countries have changed over the years. So this graphic shows the top decliners and the top improvers in the last year. The 20 countries with the biggest declines in 2025 are shown on the left in red, and the 20 most improved countries are shown on the right in blue. As we can see, Russia was the biggest decliner in the 2025 index with a negative 4.9% growth rate, and the Dominican Republic was the biggest improver with a 2.1% growth rate. Okay, so what is the story globally? I think probably a lot of us know from reading the news, but it's kind of, we think it's interesting to look at the data that kind of backs that up. So for the 8th consecutive year, we're seeing that the rule of law has weakened in more countries than those in which it improved. So this year, 96 countries declined in rule of law versus 46 improved in our index. In other words, 68% of our countries declined, 32% improved. In the wake of the COVID pandemic, the share of countries experiencing the rule of law declines had been gradually decreasing, getting smaller, which was good. In contrast to recent years, though, the 2025 index shows that global rule of law, the global rule of law recession is accelerating once again. So that means rule of law is declining at a faster rate once again. Globally. So the share of countries that is experiencing a deterioration in the rule of law scores did increase sharply between this year and last year. So we have 57% of countries were declining in 2024 versus the 68% that are declining this year. So the spike in this percentage of worsening scores again, points to an acceleration in the rule of law recession. And we'll talk a little bit about what is causing that or prompting that in the next couple of slides. Okay, so sorry. I'm not good at doing all of these things at the same time. I apologize. So this is a heat map showing the percentage change in overall score between 2024 and 2025. This label is working, but so the blue countries or countries that are in blue are the countries that are showing improvements in rule of law or positive growth rates in the past year, and the countries in the darker red shades are countries that are showing declines in growth rate in the past year. So we can see, as I said on the previous slide, we had 32% of countries improved this year, 68% of countries declined. So most of the map is red in this case for the past year. Okay, so what is influencing this rule of law recession? Really what we see in our data is a rise in authoritarianism that's driving the recession. So weakening rule of law around the world can be explained by widespread declines in these 4 factors. So we have constraints on government powers. Declines are driven by deterioration in the limits by the legislature and the judiciary, and independent auditing and review primarily. We also have open government declining in 66% of countries. So restrictions on open government were caused by declines in civic participation and the right to information. Then we have weakening fundamental rights. Again, in 66% of countries, we see declines in this factor. And this was a result of greater restrictions on freedom of opinion and freedom of expression, and also freedom of assembly and association. And then the 4th factor that is causing this decline in rule of law is civil justice. So we're seeing 68% of countries have declines in their civil justice score. That was driven by longer delays in civil justice procedures, less effective alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and an increased government influence in many countries around the world. So this rise in authoritarianism, it was defined by weakening checks and balances, shrinking civic space, which we just saw on the slide before, but it's really captured by widespread declines in 3 different key indicators of government accountability. So we see in our data that 61% of countries saw declines in legislative checks on executive power in the last year. 63% of countries saw declines in independent auditing and oversight of government powers in the last year. And 61% of countries saw declines in judicial limits on government powers in the last year. So these things are all leading to a rise in authoritarianism and driving the rule of law recession. So we're also seeing that civic space is shrinking. Civic space, as we know, it enables people to participate in public life, and it's really necessary for societies with strong rule of law. In the past year, over 70% of countries have cut back on the safeguards that keep governments open, accountable, and responsive. So we see over 70% of countries are experiencing a shrinking of civic freedoms in their country. And then we're also seeing that free speech is being silenced. So in the past year, 3 essential civil and political rights have been curtailed in the majority of countries. We have 73% of countries showing declines in freedom of opinion and expression, 72% of countries showing declines in freedom of assembly and association, and 71% of countries showing declines in civic participation. And finally, what might be most relevant to this group and to this conference, we did see this year a decline in judicial independence, or indicators measuring judicial independence. So judicial independence is definitely under threat. In 61% of countries, we see that judicial limits on executive power have declined. In 62% of countries, we see that criminal justice, or the concept of criminal justice being free of improper government influence has declined, meaning criminal justice is becoming, or improper influence is seeping more into the criminal justice system. And then in 67% of countries, that improper government influence is also seeping into civil justice systems more often. And just another kind of fact that we pulled out of our data is, and I think this is something we all kind of inherently know, but again, interesting to see in the data, building resilient rule of law institutions takes a lot of time, but they can be dismantled very quickly. So we saw that for the countries that improved, the average rate of improvement was about 0.52% over the course of the year. And for countries that declined, the average rate of decline was negative 1.07%. So countries are declining in terms of rule of law at about twice the pace as countries are improving. So yeah, we kind of, that emphasizes the point that it is very easy to take these kind of institutions apart, but it does take a lot of time to build them up. Okay, well, it's not all a sad story or a bad story. We don't want to be kind of the bearers of bad news. We do see that progress is possible around the world. These are some of the leaders, or the regional leaders in rule of law improvements in the last year. So Dominican Republic was our global, or our top improver globally, with a 2.1% increase in score. In Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, we had Senegal leading the pack with a 1.6 improvement in score. In South Asia, we see Bangladesh with the biggest improvement in score. And in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it's North Macedonia. Both are at 1.3% improvements. In East Asia and the Pacific, Thailand is the biggest improver with a 1.0% improvement. Middle East and North Africa, the UAE, improved by 0.7%. And in Western Europe and North America, we had Poland with a 0.4% improvement in score. So progress is possible, but the overall story is unfortunately this rule of law recession that we're seeing. So before we go on to findings for the U.S., are there any questions about the global findings or the methodology? Just so we don't leave any questions till the very end.
All this is driven from your surveys.
Yes.
Strictly from your surveys, the information.
Yep.
Okay.
No AI involved. No AI.
No. And I think, as Alicia mentioned, aside from the third-party sources which we use to validate the data, all of the sources for each country are from people who live in that country. So,
So the household survey is a randomly selected sample of people. We work with a local polling partner, and they determine some sort of kind of random route to take. So they might say, all right, we will start in, the city center of X city, and then we will, knock on the door of every 5 households. We will knock on that door. So they have different ways of ensuring that the route that they take is random, but they're nationally representative studies. We make sure that the sample is nationally representative in terms of the urban versus rural divide. So we get all over the country. We make sure it's nationally representative in terms of age, income groups, gender, and administrative unit as well. So, but yes, these are just general people. Someone will knock on your door for the most part, and you will be asked to take a survey. Of course, anyone can decline. In some high income countries, we do online surveys because it's very, very expensive to do the surveys in person. But again, those are still as much as possible kind of randomly selected people. And we do make sure, again, that the survey is representative by all those different demographic groups. For the experts, these are lawyers. These are other legal practitioners, legal academics, individuals that work at law schools, or lawyers that work at law schools and teach law, and also some public health practitioners. Important to note, we don't survey government officials. We also don't survey, lawyers that work for the government or judges that have been elected, or any judges for that matter, because we want to make sure that our index is at least coming from the perspective of the people or the individuals that represent the people in their justice journeys. We do, yeah. Yeah.
Similar, but you said that historically you've polled 1,000 people.
For the households, yeah.
Okay, for the households. So how did you reach that number, and is that going to shift?
So that is actually, I mean, like statistically, about a 300-person sample should be okay in any given country, but we try to make it a little bit more robust. So 1,000 is something that is financially feasible and also statistically pretty robust for us to do. It probably will not shift, though. I mean, there's a little bit of a funding aspect to it. So if someone, gives us a lot of money and says, we want to do a really big survey in this country, we can do that. It's just for the index, we will do, the standard is 1,000 because it's it's robust enough and financially feasible. We have done studies in other countries in Mexico and the EU, for example. We've done subnational studies. So in Mexico, we did a study of each of the 32 states, and we measured adherence to rule of law in each of those states. And each of those states had more than 1,000 people surveyed for the household survey. And then for the European Union, we measured rule of law adherence in each. There are 110 what are called NUTS regions in the European Union. So each of the countries is broken down into these NUTS regions. So we measured rule of law adherence in each of the regions, and each of the regions had I think about 500 people surveyed, and each country has multiple regions. So some countries that are bigger had, maybe 6,000 people surveyed. Other countries that are a little smaller had, somewhere between probably 1,000 and 6,000. So yeah, it depends a little on the project, but for the index, that's kind of our standard because that's something that we can make sure we can do.
Any other questions?
All right, let's get into the U.S.
Yeah. So the question, just for the people online, the question was, how do you maintain the participation rate in the survey?
This is a very good question, and this is maybe where some of you all can help us a little bit. So in terms of the household surveys, it's there is people obviously do decline to take the surveys, but because we're hiring the polling company to get a certain number of surveys, they will just keep going door to door until they get the number that they need. We have not yet exhausted a country in terms of households, so luckily that has been lucky for us. For the expert surveys, it is definitely harder. So many people are asked to take so many surveys these days. Emails can get lost in spam. People have survey fatigue. So it can be pretty difficult for us to get survey responses in some countries. Some countries are great and it's very easy. Some countries are more difficult. So what we do is we try to develop partnerships as much as we can with local bar associations or universities, law schools, universities, law firms who can kind of help vouch for us and say to their constituents, hey, this is an important survey, you should take this. If someone recommends a survey, it's always a little bit, I think people are a little bit more likely to actually take the survey than if they get kind of a cold email from us. So trying to have those kind of partnerships and relationships in country is very helpful. We also do ask each of our participants for referrals. And so if we can then, send the survey to these referrals and say, hey, your colleague, recommended that you take this survey, that also helps. So a little bit of it is just kind of relationship building in the countries and having those kind of in-person connections.
Yeah, and I think importantly, we don't pay any of our participants to take the surveys to maintain the independence of the data, in the same way that we don't let anybody who works for the government of that country take the survey, because that would also impact the independence of the data. So we take these measures to make sure that everyone who's taking it is unbiased, or at least unbiased in relation to the results. So that does make it more challenging to get people to take the surveys. But so far we've been able to find the respondents that we need.
And there's no maximum for the expert surveys. If we could get all of the lawyers in the country to take the survey, that would be the best case scenario. I don't know if we'll get there, but the more the merrier. The more experts we have that respond, the more robust the results are.
Okay. Any other questions?
Good questions. Thank you, guys.
and keep them coming.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so now that you've gotten kind of the global picture, we are going to now tell you about what the data says about the U.S. And I think, you may not be surprised to hear that the U.S. is following this global trend of rule of law decline. So this is a snapshot of the U.S.'s score as it appears in our index. This is actually different than the slide that was in the presentation. So the U.S. currently ranks 27th out of 143 countries in the index. So it is, it's ranked high. But to put that in context, 10 years ago, the U.S. ranked 18th. So it's fallen from 18 to 27 over 10 years. And during that time, the score has declined 7.7%. And these numbers, these are just numbers like percentage decline and score that they might not, they don't mean a lot in a vacuum. But to put it in context, so the U.S. score declined by 7.7%. The average country declined by 6.4%. So the U.S. is also declining faster than the average country. And you can see, I don't know what the next slide's going to be because this is actually a little different than my. Okay, no, we're going to go back. So the U.S. did have a slight improvement in its rule of law score from 2021 to 2022, and actually a lot of countries did. This was right after the worst of COVID, so there was a little bump in improvement, sort of a recovery. But then the score since then has continued. Unfortunately, to decline. And this score decline, it pretty much matches the trends that we're seeing around the world that Alicia just mentioned. So it's driven by, there's weaker checks on government power in the U.S., and there is a declining protection of fundamental rights. So this is what we're seeing in our data. And I think, you saw a slide earlier that showed the worst decliners. And I don't know if you noticed, but the U.S., there's a little red arrow. The U.S. is among the worst decliners. And this is for the first time since we've had comparable data in the index. So the U.S. has never been at the bottom of the decliners before. 2025 was the first year ever. So this is sort of, this is concerning. The U.S. is among the 10 countries whose score declined the most since 2024. And you probably don't remember from the slide, but the only countries that declined more were Mexico, Togo, Mozambique, Sudan, and Russia. And these are all countries that typically do not perform well in general in their rule of law. They are not, towards the top. They are usually all towards the bottom. So the U.S. is unfortunately finding itself for the first time in company of some of these countries that have a lot more work to do on their rule of law. Okay. So with that uplifting note, the next few slides, I'm going to show you how the U.S. is performing on a couple of specific sub-factors with comparisons to other countries, which are shown. Oh, I'm glad the graphics work on this slide, which are shown in the green and the orange lines. So the U.S. is the purple bar. And then the green bar is the average score for high-income countries, of which the U.S. is part of that group. And then we also group countries together with their regional partners. So for the purposes of the index, we group the U.S. with North America, which is basically U.S. and Canada, and with Europe. So the orange line is how basically Canada and Europe are doing on average. So what you can see is that the U.S. generally underperforms relative to other countries in these comparable groups on factor 1 in our index, which is constraints on government powers. And that measures basically if those who govern the country are equally bound to the law. So what you'll see in this red box here is this highlights the U.S.'s performance on the subfactor that measures the ability of the judiciary to effectively check the government. So you'll see it's below the average for its regional and income neighbors. it also has declined by almost 4% from the previous year. We highlighted this because we think it's probably of most interest to the group in this room. You can see that for other subfactors, in absence of corruption and an open government, which are the other two factors on this slide, the U.S. is actually roughly on par with other countries. And actually, the subfactor you see the subfactor on absence of corruption in the legislature, we're performing pretty badly. I'll talk about the legislature in a little bit. You might be happy to see, in like silver lining, that the subfactor that measures whether there's corruption in the judiciary, the U.S. is actually doing better than other countries that we compare it to. So you should all feel good about that. Give yourself a round of applause. I'll talk about that on the next slide. So these are a couple of the other factors that we want to highlight. So this shows subfactors on fundamental rights, on order and security, and on regulatory enforcement. Order and security is the only factor this year where the U.S.'s score actually improved. It didn't improve a lot, but it improved a little. So it did not decline. I think that's the important thing. I think one other thing you're going to see in this slide is that the U.S. does very poorly on the subfactor that measures discrimination, very poorly compared to our neighbors to Europe and Canada and to other high-income countries. Out of the high-income countries, it actually ranks third to last. So the only countries that do worse in the high-income countries are Kuwait and Hungary. And out of the regional grouping, it's second to last, only above Hungary. So I mean, that's just to say that this is an area where we have a lot, I think, of work to do in our rule of law. And the U.S. did see a decline in this subfactor in the past year, but this trend has been consistent for many years, unfortunately. So this slide is probably of a lot of interest to this group. These are the scores for civil justice and criminal justice. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the scores related to discrimination in the civil justice system and the criminal justice system are unfortunately very low compared to comparable countries, as we saw. And the scores for accessibility and affordability of civil justice are also fairly low comparatively. In the red box, you'll see the subfactor that has to do with improper government influence in civil justice and then in criminal justice. So, it's a below average performance, again, compared to other high income countries and regional countries. It's not towards the very bottom, like the discrimination subfactor, but underperforming. But again, the U.S. does perform, I'm trying to find silver linings here. Again, the U.S. does perform better than average on corruption in the civil justice system and on effective investigations in the criminal justice system. On delays and impartial and effective ADRs. So it's, I think, you'll see, I think, in later slides, there are reasons, I think, to be heartened by some of the civil justice, particularly civil justice performance of the U.S. So this is just kind of another way to show you the data. This is regional rankings. So in Europe and North America, the U.S. ranks 20th out of 31 countries. For context, 10 years ago, it ranked 13th. So we've slid from 13th to 20th in these rankings over the last 10 years. And our average regional score, the average regional score here is 0.73. The U.S. is 0.68. So we're performing, not towards the very bottom, but not as well as average. And I think one thing to note from that slide of the bottom 10 decliners. The only high-income countries that were on that slide with the bottom 10 decliners are the US and Russia. So this is more context for the score. Yeah. Someone said it's scary. It's like, yes, it's a little scary. Yeah. So here's the slide that shows you. This is the overall score. Yeah. So this is just another way to look at the overall score. You can see there was a little improvement during COVID recovery, and then the declines in the past couple of years, and then this kind of sharper decline in 2025. Okay. I'm not going to spend too long on these. I just wanted to point out a couple things. So this shows performance on the factor that has to do with constraints on government powers. There was a steep decline recently. Why? So one significant thing that we saw in the data is that we have a subfactor that measures whether the legislature can provide effective oversight of the executive. That subfactor declined by almost 10% in the past year. This was the worst decline of all of the subfactors for the U.S. So this was the legislature's inability to check government power, executive power, is the strongest driver of the U.S.'s rule of law decline according to our data. And some other significant declines related to this are government accountability by independent review and audit agencies, and checks by civil society, media, and citizens, whether non-governmental checks like those are able to actually influence government decisions. This is factor 3. This has to do with open government. It had a sharp decline in the last year. This was mostly because there has been reduced access to public information in the past year, according to our index data. I talked about fundamental rights a little bit earlier, and absence of discrimination actually improved a little bit last year. This year it declined. We've seen a contraction of civic space and a weakening protection of fundamental rights. So what's driving this is more interference with privacy, reduced access to public information, diminished protections for life and security, and then declines in freedom of opinion, expression, assembly, and association. All of those declined according to the index this year. So civil justice is actually holding fairly steady relative to some of the other factors. It had a decline, but it was not as dramatic as the other factors. We did register increased delays in civil justice, more interference in judicial decision making, and rising discrimination within the justice system. But as you're going to see on the next slide, we saw those same trends for criminal justice, but they were worse. So civil justice is performing a little better than criminal justice, according to our data. And then just a couple more slides about on this topic. So judicial independence is obviously a focus of this conference. We wanted to show some data that puts judicial independence in the U.S. in context. So this is judicial independence in the U.S. In the last 10 years. This is for the subfactor that measures whether the judiciary can exert limits on executive power. So you see it has declined quite a lot. There was a 3% decline in the last year and a 15% decline in the last 10 years. This is the subfactor for judicial independence that looks at whether civil justice is free of improper government influence. It declined 12% in the last decade, 3% last year. And then the next slide is for criminal justice, which took the biggest hit. There was a 3% decline in the last year as well, but there's been a 16% decline in the last 10 years. So I think we've thrown a lot of information at you, and it's pretty sobering, and these trends are concerning. But we think that, and this is why we produce the index. we hope it provides some important context for what specifically is happening when we talk about, rule of law is under attack or judicial independence is weakening. And we produce the data, so, in the hopes that we can point to some really specific areas, which is why we do the sub-factors of exactly where this is happening. And, our goal in creating this information is that it can then provide a pathway for reform or for policymakers to target solutions that can hopefully bring some of these numbers up and help improve rule of law in the U.S., but also globally. And this is something that we do. We do around the world with other countries to support them to improve their rule of law. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions I can answer or we can answer about any of these slides. And also if there's any information that you'd like about the U.S. that you didn't see in the slides, we can pull up our dashboard and help you out. Yes.
So on the slides, when you're talking about corruption versus improper government influence, could you maybe explain just a little bit what the difference between those two are?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yes.
Do you want to pull up the...
Yeah. We can. Sorry. We can read you some examples of some of the questions that we ask and some of the sub factors that we include in some of those different factors. So let me just pull up our variable map, which is right here. Okay. It's hard to remember all of the questions. There's a lot of them, but yes, we can definitely, that's a good question. And a lot of people ask us that, so we can definitely help differentiate. So I'll give you some examples of questions and some of the sub components that we look at. So when we look at, okay. Wait, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong factor. Give me one moment. Okay. Okay, so affordability, procedures, accessibility of courts, discrimination. Okay, so when we look at freedom of corruption, we look at things like bribery, whether or not different lawyers or experts have had to actually have been asked for bribes or asked to or offered bribes in different situations that they're in. And then we also look at for improper government influence, the questions are things that are, not necessarily financial in nature, but we ask questions such as for a lawyer, we would say, based on your experience in the past year with, civil labor dispute cases between private parties, what percentage of cases showed, did you think reflected the judge's honest evaluation of available evidence and applicable law? In which cases do you think that the final decision was maybe influenced by undue pressure from one of the parties or influenced by maybe corruption? In your opinion, do most judges decide cases based on what the government tells them to do, what powerful private interests tell them to do, or what the law says? So that's, improper government influence is a little bit broader, and the corruption is more just about monetary corruption and bribes.
Okay. Just a question. I was curious. Our neighbors to the north. I have a lot of family up there, and they seem to be staying steady, but that's not the feeling I get from talking with people. I question why the United States would be dropping and Canada would be not. There's a lot of stuff in the news. Great Britain is having a lot of concerns, but particularly our neighbors to the north. It's interesting, that data that you shared. Just a comment and question on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great observation. We can actually, I think we're pulling, why don't we pull up to Canada and see how Canada's doing? We can tell you exactly how Canada's doing. I mean, I think the point is, we focused a lot on the US for this presentation because I think that's where we are and that's where we all work. But other countries are not immune to these declines. I mean, this, as Alicia mentioned, these authoritarian trends are impacting a lot of countries around the world.
Yeah,
including.
So Canada actually did see a decline, not as big of a decline in the past year, but it did see a decline in score. And then in terms of the different the 8 different factors, Canada registered a decline in 6 out of the 8, and it only registered improvements in very, very small improvements in 2 out of the 8. So yeah, like Lauren said, we really wanted to focus on the U.S. because we're all working in the U.S. And you all work in the U.S. court system, but definitely other countries are not immune, and Canada did register declines, not quite as big, but it's also declining as well.
Yeah. Yes, I have a compound question, I guess. Why wouldn't Mexico be in the same category as North America? And if it's because its struggles, right, are more aligned with that of, Central and South America based on your all's metrics, then why not rename it, right, that category? And I guess I bring this up because there's still so many people that don't understand, right, that Mexico is part of America, right, this entire continent, and same with a lot of our Latin neighbors to the south. And so that's, I guess, my compound question for you all.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a good question. So historically, our groupings, when we do our groupings, we follow, we've kind of looked at how different international organizations categorize countries, so the World Bank and the UN and whatnot, and we've tried to follow their groupings just for consistency over time. So it's a great point. I mean, the U.S. or Mexico technically can be part of the U.S., but because of sorry, not part of the U.S., part of North America, but because of how other international groups group these by region and income group, we have tried to follow theirs just for consistency. Sometimes we can show different groupings. These are just the kind of standard groupings that we have in our index, but we'll look at more. We'll look at Central America, or we'll look at North Africa, or we can look at different kind of sub regions, but just for the broader groupings, we do try to follow kind of other international organizations and how they group their countries.
Thank you, ladies, for this presentation. Pretty sobering and pretty horrifying. I have 2 questions. One is, although the data has only been out there, 2009 to the current, are there any lessons to be learned from looking at this for cycles? Up cycles, down cycles. Are there any lessons to be learned from that? I don't know. And the second thing, it might be interesting to, if you don't already, produce some kind of document, briefing, cheat sheet, for those of us in courts to take and use and incorporate in our repertoire of how we talk about the importance of work that we do. I'm thinking of your slide where you had the different conceptual framework items. So I'm just wondering if there's any tangible tool, if it's not already in existence, that could be pushed out to us that we could add to our toolkit.
Do you want to take questions together? Okay, we can. So I think for the second question, that's a great suggestion. We have developed some tools over the years. We have something that I think is probably a little bit out of date, but and I'm going to talk actually a little bit about some of the work that we're about to be doing in the U.S. So come talk to me afterwards, and we would love to produce information and tools for the courts, and we have a lot of these slides. We have a lot of things we can easily package to help tell the story of why rule of law is important, and just kind of get out some of these top line messages. And then to your question about cycles, it's a really interesting question. Alicia, you might know the answer. Alicia's way more in the data than me, so she might really know the answer. But I think just one observation that I've seen is that these things, these trends do tend to happen globally. So I think what we've seen is that during COVID, almost every country, almost every country, but most countries declined. And then in the past couple of years, we're seeing there is an authoritarian influence that is kind of creeping across borders because it's affecting global political incentives and global networks. And these things don't really tend to happen in a vacuum, in one region or one country. We're a very interconnected world now. So I think that's a trend that's observable from our data, particularly in the past 10 years. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's definitely very, very true. I can't remember the last time we said, oh, well, Central Asia is the only region that's experiencing this issue or something like that. It really does. It is really like global in nature. I think over the years, just something that we just like very top line, something that we've seen is really like the biggest fluctuations come from changes in constraints on government powers and fundamental rights. So as those factors improve or decline, we see index scores go up and down. We don't, we do see some adjustments, of course, in all of the other factors: regulatory enforcement, open government, civil and criminal justice. But really, like the biggest fluctuations and what causes the biggest the kind of drivers of our changes in scores, either improvements or declines, do come from changes in constraints on government powers and fundamental rights. Those are pretty much every year are some of or at least two of the biggest drivers of the changes in scores that we see. And I mean, I think that makes sense. And all of the factors, of course, are important, but in a lot of ways, factors 1 and 4 are really kind of like the core of rule of law and the core of accountability. And so kind of seeing that, I think, and maybe that points to the idea that accountability, kind of really underpins strong rule of law in different countries around the world. And you do need that to have all of the other components of the rule of law. So that's just another quick thing I would say. Yeah.
When you ask survey respondents to complete the ask, do you ask them to contemplate the federal government and its administration of the government process, or you ask them to take a look at state government?
It really is kind of like up to them in their discretion. We just talk about cases more broadly. We don't, we're not really, because in this exercise, we're not looking at, well, I guess maybe I should rewind that a little bit. So in some of our exercises where we do subnational scores and indices, we're asking at the state level or the regional level. In the global index, we're mostly asking experts to respond federally, although in some cases we kind of leave it a little more open, and it could be state or federal level. But yeah, the global index scores should really reflect the national government or the federal government. But in some cases, we know that some people are maybe practicing more at a local level, so they can still respond based on what is kind of happening at the local level. But it should really reflect nationally what's going on. Yeah.
All right. I have a question just about lessons we can learn from other countries who've had declines and then have seen the numbers rise again. Mm-hmm. So I will share that I was very lucky to be an attendee at the World Justice Forum this past year in Poland, and to hear from those personal experiences from Poland. And I would just love for you, if you have insights, what can we learn from other countries who've been through the decline and have now seen some increases, if you have any?
It's a great question. It's a big question. And yeah, so we had a conference last year in Poland, and last year Poland was the greatest worldwide improver after a period of really sustained rule of law deterioration. I mean, I think. And there's other examples as well. You saw, Dominican Republic is one of the greatest improvers. It's actually a country that we also work with. Honestly, one of the biggest indicators of whether a country is going to be able to improve its rule of law is whether the leaders in power are going to have it on their policy radar, and that can either come about through a change in government, or it can come about through, popular will or other branches of government exerting influence on decision makers. And ultimately, I think our data is used by civil society, it's used by business, it's used by multilateral organizations, but usually the change comes about when, those who are in the ultimate decision-making roles decide that they, want to take it seriously. And there's a lot of tactics in order to influence the government to take those steps. And in Poland, it was the judiciary played a role. There was a huge upswell in civil society participation. I think every country is a little bit different. But yeah, I think ultimately, it comes from policy change at the top.
Which can be pushed by
Of course,
civil society and the general public. So
yes. Other questions? Okay. So in just our last few minutes, I just want to share a little bit about some of the work that WJP is going to be doing in the U.S. in the next couple of years, and maybe entice some of you to come talk to us and share with us some of your thoughts, and feedback that you might have. So as I mentioned, these figures are very concerning. They're very concerning to us as a global rule of law organization. And it also is something that, of course, is resonating with what we're seeing in the news and we're seeing, in our everyday lives. So these numbers were not, a huge shock to us, unfortunately. So we are now undertaking a 3-year program to produce state-level rule of law information. So producing an index that would measure rule of law in U.S. states. So what we're hoping that this information can do is to help diagnose some specific state-level rule of law problems and highlight solutions, to support some agendas for policy reform, and to develop some impactful narratives that can hopefully play, even a small role in addressing some of these issues. I think Alicia mentioned this, but we've done this in Mexico, and we've done this also in the European Union, so producing very local level rule of law information, and that we found that at the state level, it's often a little bit more actionable for policymakers to know what to do with the data. It's easier to divert resources. It's easier to think about policy change when you're looking at a smaller problem than like the entire country. But if you're looking at one particular state, it can be a little bit more actionable. So there's going to be a couple of different components of our program. The primary one is going to be this rule of law assessment. So similar to the index, we're going to be producing comparative state-by-state data on priority rule of law topics, starting with just a couple of states, probably a pilot in up to 10 states. And it's going to focus on a reduced set of factors, so not all 8 of those factors that are in the global index, but variables that have more to do with rule of law backsliding or resilience, and differences in how state-level institutions respond to pressures on their independence and their integrity. So more in the fundamental rights, constraints on government powers area of the index, less on regulatory enforcement and order and security, for example. And then we're also partnering with groups who we want to support to use the data at the state level. So collaborating with state level partners to do many things to provide feedback on the methodology that we develop for this index, which will be different than the methodology we use for the global index, to identify what kinds of things we should be measuring in each state to help us amplify the results when we get it, and then to, most importantly, to use the data for decision-making, for advocacy, for communications, for whatever the data points to as a policy solution. And then, as I mentioned before, trying to amplify some of these narratives to promote a better understanding of the rule of law and why it is important in people's everyday lives, and what's at stake in the U.S. So we have a couple of discussion questions. I think we only have a few minutes left, so these are some of the things that we're really curious to hear from you, reflecting on some of the data that we shared, and also reflecting on some of the things that we want to be orienting ourselves towards when we are doing the state level index. So what are some of the most pressing rule of law issues in your states? Maybe they're different than a neighboring state. How have some of your rule of law institutions, your courts, shown resilience against some kinds of rule of law backsliding, and why? What kinds of best practices can be highlighted that other states could use? And then are there any existing initiatives where that data that we produce would be helpful to you? So that's ultimately, our goal is to provide data that's helpful for folks in states to use. So, I think these are big questions. And like I said, it would be great to hear reactions from anybody in here now, or come talk to us after the session.
Yeah, so you can either take answers to these questions or other questions that you might have from the presentation, either or.
And then I think we also want to get them to sign up for the,
Yeah. Well, should we maybe stay here for a minute?
yeah.
Any immediate reactions to some of these big existential questions? Not easy questions, we know.
We've in our state originally all of our judiciary, the state judiciary is elected, and recently within the past 2 to 5 years, they've started requiring our Supreme Court justices and our appellate justices to declare a party in their elections. And it's becoming more, and I think the partisan politics has becoming more and more polarizing in how the rule of law is being put forward.
Can I ask what state you're from?
Ohio.
I thought it might be Ohio.
That is
Just following on that, in Arizona, merit selection with the retaining of judges, that's become more polarized too, I think, right, Janet? People take to the streets on one issue, and you get people coming in from out of state pushing money towards trying to move judges out because of some of the things they've done. So whether it's election or a merit-based system, still similar types of influence.
Thank you.
Big money.
Yeah, that's super important.
Hi. When the data shows improvement or decline, I know it's broken down into all of the subcategories, but is there ever any data or information released about any specific actions that the country took to either improve their score in that subcategory or that led to the decrease in that score, so that, other jurisdictions can get ideas of how to make a concrete change?
Yeah, it's a good question. So our data is all output oriented. So we're not looking at necessarily like what states or countries are doing to produce these changes. Partially that is because we know that all countries are different, and we don't want to prescribe some sort, a certain type of ideals or way of government or governance to different countries. So we look at, we say, we want you to have timely trials. How you get there, we don't really, it's not as important to us as long as you get to this output. So yeah, we're not looking at inputs, we're looking at outputs. The other thing is that with the kind of the other reason that we do that is that with rule of law is such an all-encompassing topic that we really can't establish causation between certain actions and our data. We can look and say, okay, there was an election in this country this year, and factor one declined a lot, or factor one improved a lot. There's likely a correlation between the two, but there's so many other factors that are driving rule of law changes that we can't say, there's a direct one-to-one, we can't say that there's like a direct causation between the two, between anything a country does and, what the scores say, or how the scores change. We can say there's likely a correlation, but we just can't say 100% this is what caused this. So that's another reason that we just focus more on the outputs versus inputs. But yeah, you can kind of group countries together, say, okay, all of these countries have had this change, an improvement here, a decline here. What do they have in common? Okay, maybe there's something here that we, a general trend that might help countries improve on this factor, or that might make countries decline on this factor. But yeah, I wish we could say exactly what is the cause, but at least statistically, it's a little, would be a little bit irresponsible of us to say.
Yeah, but I think, anecdotally, we do work with a few different countries more closely to help them improve their score. So in some of those countries, we are able to kind of get a sense of what's going on, and in a lot of those places, we're working with like the Ministry of Justice, for example, and they're incorporating our data into the monitoring plans for their strategic plans for their ministry. So they're using it to monitor, if like they're able to provide more accessible justice in the civil justice system, for example. So in those cases, we are able to get a little bit more data and produce like some lessons learned and best practices, which we've produced some reports about that are on our website.
So I was going to ask, what do you think are the biggest drivers for the decline of the rule of law in this country or in this country? But I'm not sure that you can give that based on the answer you just gave. So let me rephrase it this way. What do you think this group of court managers can do in their jurisdictions to help increase the rule of law score for the United States?
So that's we can kind of say, well, okay. So maybe what I meant to say earlier is that we can't say what specific inputs are causing the improvements or declines, but we can say, okay, for the U.S. overall rule of law is declining, and it's driven by declines in factor 1 and factor 4. We don't know specifically we can't say specifically this action, that policy change drove those declines in 1 and 4, but we do. The index scores are a simple average of all of the factors. So, of course, any factor that declines more is going to bring the score down. So we can say these are the kind of outputs that are driving declines in the score. It's just we can't say what the inputs are. So for the U.S., it really is factors 1 and 4. So constraints on government powers and fundamental rights are the biggest decliners in the U.S. Open government and civil justice are also big decliners, but it is really 1 and 4 that I think are the main drivers. In terms of what this group can do to help, I think
I'm looking at some of the sub-factors that have to do with courts.
Yeah. I mean, I think at least for the U.S., we see really. Wait, this is the U.S. Oh yeah, this is the U.S. Okay. Yeah. So in the U.S., what we're seeing in terms of civil justice, we can get a little bit more specific and say what is kind of the biggest decliner within the civil justice system. The biggest decliner really is 7.5, so civil justice not being subject to unreasonable delay. We saw a decline of about 6% in that score over the past year. So people are feeling as though the courts are slower in terms of providing their judgments and in terms of kind of processing their disputes. That's at least the biggest the biggest decline we're seeing within civil justice, followed by improper government influence. So a lack of, people are seeing or feeling that there is more improper government influence in the civil justice system. That declined by about 4%. So I mean, I think we've talked about this in some of these different sessions. Part of I think something that can help improve things is like public education and awareness of how the courts work and how judgments actually work and how trials work, and what actually goes into coming up with a judgment in a case. I think in a lot of cases, maybe people are influenced by the news or influenced by what they see on TV. And so maybe some like increased education and awareness of how some of these systems actually work might help them see that, the government is actually countering, the courts are actually countering the government in this case. So that could be one thing. And then in terms of civil or criminal justice, the biggest drops we see are, that's probably not for this group. Again, improper government influence is really one of the biggest drivers of the decline in the criminal justice system. So probably at least one portion of that would be some kind of education campaigns or campaigns to show what the courts are doing to actually push back against government influence and government overreach. Can't do anything.
I mean, I think some of these trends are unfortunately, not something that, court administrators or, court representatives can do on their own. But I think, what our hope is that having awareness of this data and having awareness of some of the sub-factors can, support you, and also to show that, it's evidence based, and it's data driven. I think one thing that we just want to show, because I think we are out of time. Please, as Alicia mentioned, we're always looking for more experts to contribute to the index. As Alicia said, the more the better. So this is for current legal practitioners, academics, and public health experts. And so there's a QR code to sign up. The expert surveys cover the following topics. If you or anyone might be interested in participating in the U.S. survey as an expert, please take a picture of this slide, and you can also sign up on our website. And I think with that, we will
We're done.
Go.
I'll remind you, please fill out your surveys. And it's in ballroom A, which is lunch.
Thank you.